The snow fell thick and heavy across the Nebraska plains that Christmas Eve of 1962, each flake adding another layer to the blanket that had been suffocating the small town of Cedar Ridge for 3 days straight. The wind howled through the empty streets like a lonely ghost, rattling windows and sending shivers through anyone brave enough to venture outside. Most folks had long since retreated to their warm homes, where Christmas trees twinkled with colored lights and the smell of ham and apple pie filled every corner. But in a small apartment above Henderson's general store, 22-year-old Mei Lin sat huddled beneath a thin blanket, watching her breath form small clouds in the frigid air. The radiator had given up the fight against winter 2 days ago, and the landlord, Mr. Henderson, had made it clear that repairs would have to wait until after the holidays. The apartment felt more like a cave than a home, with its bare walls and sparse furniture that had come with the place. Mei Lin pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and tried to ignore the gnawing hunger that had become her constant companion. She had not eaten a proper meal in 2 days, surviving on crackers and water from the tap. Her husband, David Chun, had promised to send money from his construction job in Denver, but weeks had passed without a word. The last letter she received had been filled with excuses about delayed payments and promises that things would get better soon. She had come to America 6 months ago as a picture bride, a practice that was becoming less common, but still existed in some communities. David had seemed kind in his letters, describing a life of opportunity and happiness in the American West. He had sent a photograph of himself standing beside a shiny car, wearing a nice suit, with a confident smile that had made her believe in the dreams he painted with his words. The reality had been far different. David worked sporadic construction jobs that kept him away for weeks at a time. When he was home, he spent most of his earnings at the local tavern, leaving Mei Lin with barely enough money for rent and food. The small Chinese community in Denver where they had first lived had tried to help, but David had insisted on moving to Cedar Ridge, claiming there were better opportunities in the smaller town. Cedar Ridge had proven to be anything but welcoming. With a population of just over 800 people, the arrival of a Chinese woman had caused quite a stir. Some residents stared openly when she walked down Main Street to the general store. Others crossed to the other side of the street, whispering among themselves about the strange foreign woman who spoke broken English and wore different clothes. Mrs. Patterson, who lived in the apartment next door, had made her feelings clear from the first day. "I don't know what kind of arrangement you people have," she had said, looking Mei Lin up and down with obvious disgust, "but decent Christian folks don't appreciate your kind bringing their heathen ways to our community." The words had stung more than the cold wind that now rattled her windows. Mei Lin had been raised Catholic by missionary teachers in Hong Kong, but explaining this to Mrs. Patterson seemed impossible when the woman refused to listen to anything she had to say. Dr. Morrison, the town physician, had been one of the few people to show her any kindness. When she had caught a terrible cold in November, he had treated her without payment and had even given her some extra blankets. "You need to take better care of yourself, young lady," he had said in his gentle voice. "This prairie winter will test anyone, but you look like you haven't been eating enough." She had wanted to tell him about her situation, about David's absence, and the dwindling money, but shame had kept her silent. In Hong Kong, her family had been poor but proud. Her father had worked hard in the shipyards, and her mother had taken in sewing to make ends meet. They had taught her that accepting charity was a last resort, something to be avoided if at all possible. But now, sitting in the dark apartment with Christmas Eve turning into Christmas morning, Mei Lin realized that pride might be a luxury she could no longer afford. The wind outside grew stronger, and she could hear Mrs. Patterson's radio playing Christmas carols through the thin walls. The familiar melody of Silent Night drifted through the apartment, making her feel more alone than ever. She thought about her family back in Hong Kong, wondering what they were doing at this moment. The time difference meant it was already Christmas afternoon there. Her younger sister, Li Hua, would be helping their mother prepare the special meal they always made for the holiday. Her father would be telling stories about Christmases past, when he had been a young man working on the British ships that came through the harbor. The longing for home hit her like a physical pain. She had known that leaving Hong Kong would mean missing her family, but she had not anticipated this crushing sense of isolation. In her letters home, she had painted a picture of American life that was far from the truth. She wrote about the beautiful countryside and the kind people she had met, carefully omitting the details about David's drinking and the cold reception from most of the townspeople. A sudden noise from outside made her look toward the window. Through the frost-covered glass, she could see the warm glow of lights from the houses across the street. Families were gathered around their Christmas trees, opening presents and sharing meals. Children's laughter echoed faintly through the night air, a sound that made her remember her own childhood Christmases with painful clarity. She stood up from the small chair where she had been sitting and moved to the window, pressing her face against the cold glass. The street was empty except for a few cars parked along the curb, their surfaces covered with snow. Most of the houses had wreaths on their doors and lights strung along their eaves, creating a magical winter scene that looked like something from a Christmas card. But the beauty of the scene only intensified her feeling of being on the outside looking in. She was a stranger in this place, an unwelcome visitor in a community that had made it clear she did not belong. Even if she had the money to buy food and heat for her apartment, she would still be alone, still be the foreign woman that people whispered about when they thought she could not hear. The hunger that had been gnawing at her stomach suddenly intensified, making her feel dizzy and weak. She made her way back to the chair and sat down heavily, pulling the blanket around her once again. The apartment seemed to grow colder with each passing hour, and she began to worry that she might not make it through the night. She thought about going downstairs to knock on someone's door, to ask for help or at least for some food. But the memory of Mrs. Patterson's harsh words and the suspicious looks from other townspeople made her hesitate. What if they turned her away? What if they called the police and reported her as some kind of vagrant or troublemaker? The fear of rejection kept her in the chair, shivering and hungry as the snow continued to fall outside. She closed her eyes and tried to pray the way the missionary teachers had taught her back in Hong Kong. But the words seemed to get lost in the cold air, as if even God could not hear her in this lonely place. As the night wore on, Mei Lin found herself thinking about the decision that had brought her to this moment. The marriage broker in Hong Kong had painted such a wonderful picture of life in America. These American men, he had said, they treat their wives like queens. You'll have a big house, nice clothes, and all the food you can eat. David's letters had seemed to confirm this promise. He had written about his successful business and his plans for their future together. He had sent photographs of himself looking prosperous and confident, and had included pictures of Cedar Ridge that made the small town look charming and welcoming. But the man who had met her at the train station in Denver had been different from the one in the photographs. Thinner, with nervous eyes, and clothes that had seen better days. His car was not the shiny vehicle from the picture, but an old truck with rust spots and a rattling engine. And his manner had been distant, almost apologetic, as if her arrival was somehow an inconvenience rather than the joyful reunion they had both anticipated. The first few weeks in Denver had been difficult, but manageable. David had rented a small room in a boarding house run by a Chinese family, and Mei Lin had been able to communicate with the other residents in Cantonese. The work had been hard. She had taken in laundry and mending to help pay for their expenses, but there had been a sense of community that had made the challenges bearable. But David had grown increasingly restless in Denver. He complained about the competition for construction jobs and the high cost of living in the city. When he heard about opportunities in the smaller towns of Nebraska, he had been eager to make the move. "We can have a better life there," he had promised. "The cost of living is lower, and there will be less competition for work." The move to Cedar Ridge had been a disaster from the beginning. The promised construction work had proven to be sporadic and low-paying. David had grown frustrated and had begun drinking more heavily. Their relationship, which had been strained from the start due to the artificial nature of their marriage arrangement, had deteriorated rapidly under the pressure of financial stress and social isolation. The final straw had come 3 weeks ago when David had announced that he was leaving to look for work in Colorado. "I'll send money as soon as I get established," he had said, avoiding her eyes as he packed his few belongings into a battered suitcase. "This is just temporary. I'll come back for you when I have enough saved for us to start over somewhere else." But Maylin had seen the relief in his eyes as he prepared to leave. She understood that she had become a burden to him, a reminder of promises he could not keep and dreams that had turned into nightmares. His departure had been as much an escape from their failed marriage as it was a search for economic opportunity. Now, sitting alone in the cold apartment on Christmas Eve, she wondered if she would ever see David again. Part of her hoped she would not. Despite the loneliness and fear that filled her days, there was also a strange sense of liberation in his absence. For the first time since arriving in America, she was free to make her own choices, even if those choices were limited by her circumstances. The sound of church bells echoing across the town interrupted her thoughts. Midnight had arrived, marking the official beginning of Christmas Day. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faint sound of voices singing Christmas carols. The melody was beautiful, but haunting, a reminder of all the celebrations she was missing, all the warmth and fellowship that seemed so far beyond her reach. As the bells fell silent, Maylin made a decision that would change everything. She could not continue like this, alone and starving in a town that did not want her. Tomorrow, Christmas Day or not, she would have to find a way to ask for help. Her pride and fear of rejection seemed trivial compared to the very real possibility that she might not survive another week without food and heat. She had heard that Dr. Morrison attended the Methodist church on the edge of town. Perhaps she could find him there and ask for his assistance. He had been kind to her before, and she hoped that the spirit of Christmas might make him willing to help her find a solution to her desperate situation. With this small spark of hope to warm her, Maylin pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and tried to get some sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but it might also bring the help she so desperately needed. As she drifted off, she whispered a prayer in Cantonese, asking for the strength to face whatever the morning might bring. The snow continued to fall outside, covering the world in a pristine white blanket that made everything look clean and new. And somewhere in that snowy landscape, forces were already in motion that would soon transform Maylin's lonely Christmas into the beginning of a new chapter in her life, though she could not yet imagine how dramatically her world was about to change. Christmas morning dawned gray and cold, with the snow still falling steadily across the Nebraska plains. Maylin woke to the sound of wind rattling her windows and the distant laughter of children playing in the snow. Every muscle in her body ached from sleeping in the uncomfortable chair, and the hunger that gnawed at her stomach had become almost unbearable. She stood slowly, her legs shaky from lack of food and the constant cold that seeped into her bones. Through the frost-covered window, she could see families emerging from their houses, bundled in warm coats, and heading toward the various churches that dotted the small town. The sight of their obvious happiness and prosperity made her feel even more isolated and desperate. Dr. Morrison had mentioned attending the Methodist church, and Maylin decided that this would be her best chance to find help. She had no idea what she would say to him, how she would explain her situation without completely humiliating herself, but she knew she could not continue much longer without food and heat. She dressed in her best outfit, a simple blue dress that had been new when she left Hong Kong, but now showed the wear of her difficult months in America. Over it, she put on the thin coat that was her only protection against the brutal Nebraska winter. It was woefully inadequate for the weather, but it was all she had. The walk to the Methodist church took nearly 20 minutes through the snow-covered streets. With each step, her feet grew colder in her worn shoes, and her breath formed clouds in the frigid air. Several cars passed her on the road, their occupants staring curiously at the lone figure making her way through the storm. None of them stopped to offer her a ride. By the time she reached the church, the service had already begun. She could hear voices singing hymns from inside the warm building, and the sound drew her like a beacon. But as she approached the front steps, her courage began to fail. What if Dr. Morrison was not there? What if the congregation rejected her presence just as the rest of the town had done? She stood outside the church for several minutes, shivering in the cold and trying to gather her nerve. The wind whipped around the building, carrying with it the faint aroma of coffee and something sweet that made her stomach clench with hunger. Through the stained glass windows, she could see the warm glow of lights and the shadows of people inside. Finally, the cold became too much to bear, and she pushed open the heavy wooden door. The warmth hit her like a wall, and she had to pause for a moment to let her body adjust. The church was nearly full, with families sitting together in the wooden pews, their voices raised in song. At the front of the sanctuary, a choir dressed in red robes was leading the congregation in "O Come, All Ye Faithful." Several heads turned as she entered, and she saw the familiar mixture of curiosity and suspicion in their eyes. An elderly woman near the back moved her purse to the seat beside her, clearly indicating that Mei Lin was not welcome to sit there. Another family whispered among themselves, their disapproval obvious even though she could not hear their words. But then she saw Dr. Morrison sitting in the third row with a woman who must be his wife and 2 young children. He noticed her entrance and smiled warmly, motioning for her to join them. The kindness in his gesture nearly brought tears to her eyes, and she made her way carefully down the aisle, trying to ignore the stares and whispers that followed her progress. "Miss Chun," Dr. Morrison whispered as she approached their pew. "How wonderful to see you here. Please sit with us." His wife, a pleasant-looking woman with graying hair, moved over to make room, though her smile seemed somewhat forced. As Mei Lin settled into the pew, she felt overwhelmed by the warmth of the church and the simple human kindness that Dr. Morrison had shown her. The service continued around her, with readings from the Christmas story and more hymns, but she found it difficult to concentrate on anything except the gnawing hunger in her stomach and the growing desperation of her situation. When the service ended, the congregation began to file out slowly, exchanging Christmas greetings and making plans for family gatherings. Dr. Morrison turned to her with concern evident in his eyes. "Miss Chun, you don't look well," he said quietly. "Are you feeling all right?" The simple question broke down the last of her defenses. Tears began to flow down her cheeks, and she found herself unable to speak. Mrs. Morrison, seeing her distress, moved closer and placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Oh, my dear," she said, her voice filled with genuine concern. "What's wrong?" Through her tears, Mei Lin managed to explain her situation. She told them about David's departure, about the lack of money for food and heat, about the cold apartment where she had spent Christmas Eve alone. The words came out in a mixture of English and Chinese, but somehow the Morrisons seemed to understand the desperation behind her broken explanation. Dr. Morrison's face grew serious as he listened to her story. When she finished speaking, he exchanged a meaningful look with his wife before turning back to Mei Lin. "This is completely unacceptable," he said firmly. "No one should spend Christmas alone and hungry. You're coming home with us right now." "Oh, but I cannot," Mei Lin protested, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "I do not want to be burdened. You have family, Christmas celebration." "Nonsense," Mrs. Morrison said decisively. "We have plenty of food, and there's always room for one more at our table. Besides, it's Christmas. This is exactly what we should be doing." But as they prepared to leave the church, they were approached by several members of the congregation who had overheard parts of their conversation. Mrs. Patterson was among them, her face set in lines of disapproval. "Dr. Morrison," she said in a voice loud enough for others to hear, "surely you're not planning to bring this woman into your home. We don't know anything about her background or her intentions." "I know that she's cold and hungry on Christmas Day," Dr. Morrison replied, his usually gentle voice taking on a steely edge. "And I know that as Christians, we're called to help those in need. But she's not one of us, another man added. She's foreign, and her husband abandoned her. What does that say about her character? Mrs. Morrison stepped forward, her maternal instincts clearly aroused. What it says is that she's a young woman in trouble who needs our help. I'm ashamed that any member of this congregation would even question whether we should offer assistance to someone in need. The exchange was drawing attention from other churchgoers, and Mei Lin could feel the weight of their collective disapproval. She began to back toward the door, unwilling to cause further conflict for the kind family that had offered to help her. Please, she said quietly. I go now. I not want to make trouble for you. But before she could reach the door, another voice cut through the tension in the air. What's all the fuss about? Everyone turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man approaching the group. He was perhaps 40 years old, with weathered features and calloused hands that spoke of a life spent working outdoors. His clothes were clean, but simple, the practical attire of a working man rather than the Sunday best worn by most of the congregation. Frank, Dr. Morrison said, relief evident in his voice. This young lady is in need of help. Her husband has abandoned her, and she's been living without heat or adequate food. Frank's eyes moved to Mei Lin, taking in her thin frame and inadequate clothing. His gaze was direct, but not unkind, and she found herself straightening under his scrutiny. Is that so? He said simply. Then, without waiting for an answer, he turned to address the group of disapproving congregants. Seems to me that Christmas is exactly the right time to help someone who needs it. Don't recall Jesus asking about anyone's nationality before he helped them. Mrs. Patterson's face flushed red. Mr. Thompson, surely you understand our concerns. We have to think about the welfare of our community. I understand that there's a young woman who needs help, and a bunch of people standing around making excuses instead of providing it, Frank replied bluntly. His voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. He turned back to Mei Lin, and his expression softened slightly. What's your name, miss? Mei Lin, she replied quietly. Mei Lin Chun. Well, Mei Lin, I'm Frank Thompson. I run a ranch about 10 miles outside of town. Right now, it looks like you could use a good meal and a warm place to stay. I've got both. The offer hung in the air for a moment, and Mei Lin found herself staring at this unexpected rescuer. Frank Thompson was not a handsome man in the conventional sense, but there was something solid and dependable about him that reminded her of her father. His offer seemed genuine, without any hidden expectations or conditions. I do not know what to say, she managed. So you let me help, Frank replied simply. Christmas is meant to be spent with family, and it seems like yours is either far away or not worth much. Sometimes you have to make your own family. Dr. Morrison stepped forward, extending his hand to Frank. That's very generous of you, Frank. I was planning to invite Miss Chun to our home, but I think your ranch might be exactly what she needs. Got plenty of room, Frank confirmed. And my housekeeper, Rosa, would enjoy having another woman around the place. She's been after me for years to get married, but I keep telling her I'm too set in my ways. Maybe having a house guest will keep her from matchmaking for a while. Despite her desperate situation, Mei Lin found herself almost smiling at his matter-of-fact tone. There was something reassuring about Frank's straightforward manner, so different from David's nervous energy and broken promises. Mrs. Patterson made one final attempt to intervene. Mr. Thompson, surely you're not thinking clearly. What will people say about an unmarried man taking in a foreign woman? The impropriety alone, what people say is their business, Frank cut her off. What I do on my own land is mine. And if anyone has a problem with Christian charity, they could take it up with me personally. The firmness in his voice left no room for argument, and the group of disapproving congregants began to disperse, muttering among themselves as they made their way toward the church doors. Mrs. Patterson shot one last, disapproving look at Mei Lin before following the others outside. Dr. Morrison turned to Mei Lin with a smile. I think you'll be in good hands with Frank. He's one of the most decent men I know. Thank you, Mei Lin said, bowing slightly in the Chinese fashion. You and Mrs. Morrison very kind to me. I not forget. Mrs. Morrison hugged her gently. You take care of yourself, dear. And remember, if you ever need anything, medical attention, or just someone to talk to, don't hesitate to contact us. As the church emptied around them, Frank turned to Mei Lin with a practical expression. Do you have belongings that need collecting? Yes, but not many things. I live above general store. We'll stop there on our way out of town. Get whatever you need, and we'll head to the ranch. Rosa's probably got Christmas dinner about ready, and she always cooks enough to feed half the county. They walked together through the snowy streets to Henderson's general store, Frank's presence seeming to shield Mei Lin from the curious stares and whispered comments of other townspeople. His stride was confident and unhurried, as if helping stranded women was something he did every Christmas morning. At the general store, Mei Lin quickly gathered her few possessions, some clothes, a photograph of her family back in Hong Kong, and the small amount of money she had left. Frank waited patiently in the truck, the engine running to keep the cab warm. As they drove away from Cedar Ridge, heading out onto the snow-covered prairie, Mei Lin found herself feeling something she had not experienced since arriving in America. Hope. She did not know what awaited her at Frank's ranch, or how long his hospitality would last, but for the first time in weeks, she was not alone. The landscape outside the truck windows was harsh and beautiful, with endless expanses of white broken only by occasional clusters of bare trees and distant farmhouses. It was a country that demanded strength and resilience from those who chose to make it their home. As if reading her thoughts, Frank spoke for the first time since they had left town. It's tough country out here. Takes a special kind of person to make it work. But once it gets in your blood, there's no place else you'd rather be. Mei Lin nodded, understanding more than he might have expected. She had grown up in a difficult place too, where survival required determination and the ability to adapt. Perhaps, she thought, this harsh but beautiful land might finally be the place where she could build the new life she had dreamed of when she first decided to come to America. The truck continued across the prairie, carrying her toward an uncertain but hopeful future, while behind them, the small town of Cedar Ridge disappeared into the swirling snow like a difficult chapter finally coming to an end. The Thompson Ranch appeared through the swirling snow like something from a dream. After driving for what seemed like hours across the endless white prairie, Mei Lin had begun to wonder if they would ever reach their destination. But suddenly, there it was, a cluster of buildings nestled in a grove of bare cottonwood trees, smoke rising from multiple chimneys into the gray December sky. The main house was larger than anything Mei Lin had expected, a two-story structure built from honey-colored stone with a wide front porch that wrapped around two sides. Even through the falling snow, she could see that it was well-maintained, with fresh paint on the window trim and a roof that looked solid and weatherproof. Nearby stood a large red barn, several smaller outbuildings, and what appeared to be a bunkhouse for ranch hands. Frank pulled the truck up to the front of the house and turned off the engine. "Welcome to the Thompson Ranch," he said simply. "Been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather homesteaded this land back in the 1880s, and we've been working it ever since." Before Mei Lin could respond, the front door of the house burst open, and a woman emerged onto the porch. She was perhaps 50 years old, with graying black hair pulled back in a practical bun and an apron tied over her dark dress. Her face was weathered but kind, with the sort of expression that suggested she was accustomed to taking charge of situations. "Frank Thompson," she called out in accented English. "You said you would be back from church an hour ago. Christmas dinner is getting cold, and I was beginning to worry that you had driven into a ditch somewhere." Frank climbed out of the truck and gestured for Mei Lin to follow. "Rosa, I'd like you to meet Miss Mei Lin Chun. She's going to be staying with us for a while." Rosa's eyes widened as she took in Mei Lin's appearance. The young Chinese woman was clearly exhausted and underfed, shivering in her inadequate coat despite the warmth of the truck. Without hesitation, Rosa hurried down the porch steps, her maternal instincts taking over. "Dios mío," she exclaimed, switching to Spanish before catching herself. "My goodness, child, you look half frozen. Come inside immediately before you catch pneumonia." She bustled Mei Lin up the porch steps and through the front door, chattering all the while about the importance of getting warm and eating properly. Frank followed behind, carrying Mei Lin's small suitcase and smiling at Rosa's predictable reaction. The interior of the house was as impressive as the exterior. The front door opened into a spacious living room with high ceilings, comfortable furniture arranged around a massive stone fireplace, and windows that would normally offer sweeping views of the prairie. Everything was clean and well-organized, with the sort of lived-in comfort that spoke of a real home rather than just a place to sleep. Rosa immediately began fussing over Mei Lin, helping her out of her thin coat and guiding her toward the warmth of the fireplace. "You sit right here," she commanded, pushing a comfortable chair closer to the hearth. "I will bring you some hot coffee and something to eat. You look like you have not had a proper meal in weeks." "Rosa manages this house better than I manage the ranch," Frank explained to Mei Lin. "She's been here for 15 years, ever since she came up from Mexico with her husband to work on the ranch. When he died in a riding accident 5 years ago, I asked her to stay on as my housekeeper. Best decision I ever made." Rosa returned from the kitchen carrying a steaming mug of coffee and a plate loaded with food. The aroma that rose from the plate made Mei Lin's mouth water and her stomach clench with desperate hunger. There was roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and something that looked like cornbread, all arranged in generous portions that would have fed her for several days in her cold apartment. "Eat," Rosa commanded, placing the plate in Mei Lin's hands. "And do not think about arguing with me. I have been cooking all morning, and there's plenty more where this came from." Mei Lin tried to eat slowly, mindful of her manners and not wanting to appear desperate despite her hunger. But the food was delicious, seasoned with herbs and spices that reminded her of home-cooked meals from her childhood. Before she knew it, she had cleaned the entire plate. Frank had been watching her eat with a thoughtful expression. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and asked, "When was the last time you had a real meal?" Mei Lin felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. 2 days ago. Maybe 3. I had some crackers yesterday." Rosa's expression became thunderous. 3 days. "Qué barbaridad." She switched to rapid Spanish that Mei Lin could not understand, but the tone made it clear that she was expressing outrage at the idea of anyone going hungry for so long. "Rosa's upset," Frank translated unnecessarily. "She thinks anyone who doesn't eat regularly is either sick or being mistreated. In this case, it sounds like both might be true." He stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. "Miss Chun, I think we need to have a frank discussion about your situation. Dr. Morrison mentioned that your husband left you without adequate support. Is there any chance he'll be coming back?" Mei Lin considered the question carefully. David's departure had felt final, despite his promises to return. She had seen the relief in his eyes when he left, the sense of escape from a situation that had become unbearable for both of them. "I do not think so," she said quietly. "He was not happy in marriage. I was not what he expected." "And what were you expecting when you came to America?" Frank asked, his tone matter-of-fact rather than judgmental. The question opened a floodgate of emotions that Mei Lin had been struggling to contain. She found herself telling Frank and Rosa about her life in Hong Kong, about the marriage broker who had painted such wonderful pictures of American life, about David's letters and promises that had proven to be largely false. She told them about the loneliness of living in a community that saw her as an unwelcome outsider, about the shame of being abandoned by a husband who had never really wanted her in the first place. The words came out in a mixture of English and Chinese, but somehow they both seemed to understand. When she finished speaking, there was silence in the room except for the crackling of the fire and the wind outside. Rosa had tears in her eyes, and even Frank's weathered features showed signs of emotion. "You poor child," Rosa said finally, "to be so far from home and treated so badly. It is not right." Frank was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and serious. "Miss Chun, I'm going to make you an offer, and I want you to think about it carefully before you answer. This ranch is successful, but it's a lot of work for one man. Rosa manages the house perfectly, but I need help with the business side of things, keeping books, managing correspondence, dealing with buyers and suppliers. He turned to face her directly. The job would pay enough for you to be independent, to make your own choices about your future. You'd have your own room here in the house, meals with the family, and the respect that comes with honest work. The only condition is that you need to learn enough English to handle business correspondence, and you need to commit to staying at least through the spring. Mei Lin stared at him in amazement. You offer me work? Real work. Real work for real pay, Frank confirmed. I believe in taking care of my people, but I also believe in everyone pulling their own weight. If you're willing to work hard and learn what you need to know, then you'll have earned your place here. Rosa beamed with approval. This is perfect. I have been telling Frank for years that he needs help with the paperwork, and it will be so wonderful to have another woman in the house. But Mei Lin found herself hesitating. The offer was more generous than anything she had dared to hope for, but the memory of David's broken promises made her wary of trusting too easily. Why? She asked simply. Why you help me? You not know me. People in town, they say I am trouble. Frank considered the question for a moment. My grandfather came to this country with nothing but the clothes on his back and a determination to build something better for his family. He faced plenty of people who thought he didn't belong, who wanted to send him back where he came from. He gestured around the comfortable room. Everything you see here exists because someone gave him a chance to prove himself. I figure it's my turn to do the same for someone else. Rosa nodded enthusiastically. Besides, this house has been too quiet for too long. Frank works all the time, and I only have the ranch hands to cook for. It will be nice to have some female companionship. Mei Lin felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire or the hot coffee. For the first time since arriving in America, someone was offering her not just charity, but the opportunity to earn her own way, to build something of value with her own efforts. I work very hard, she said solemnly. In Hong Kong, I help my father with his business. I can learn bookkeeping, correspondence. I'm good with numbers. I don't doubt it, Frank replied. And if you're half as determined as you sound, you'll do just fine here. Rosa clapped her hands together with delight. Wonderful. Now, we must get you settled in properly. There's a nice room upstairs that will be perfect for you. It has its own window overlooking the south pasture, and plenty of space for your things. As Rosa led her upstairs to see the room, Mei Lin found herself amazed by the turn her life had taken in just a few hours. This morning she had been alone and desperate, facing the possibility of freezing or starving in her cold apartment. Now she was being offered not just shelter, but the chance to build a real life for herself. The room Rosa showed her was larger than the entire apartment she had been living in above the general store. It had a comfortable bed with a thick quilt, a dresser with a mirror, and a small desk positioned near the window. Best of all, it was warm, with heat that flowed steadily from vents connected to the furnace downstairs. Frank installed central heating 3 years ago, Rosa explained proudly. He said he was tired of chopping wood for a dozen different fireplaces. Now the whole house stays warm all winter long. Standing at the window, Mei Lin could see across the snow-covered pastures to where a group of cattle had gathered near a windmill. Even in the harsh weather, there was something peaceful and purposeful about the scene. This was a working ranch, a place where people built their lives through honest labor and careful planning. Rosa, she said quietly, do you think Mr. Thompson really means what he says about the work and staying through spring? Rosa's expression became serious. Child, Frank Thompson is the most honest man I have ever known. When he gives his word about something, you can depend on it completely. He has never lied to me or cheated anyone in all the years I have worked for him. She placed a gentle hand on Mei Lin's shoulder. I know it is hard to trust after what you have been through, but Frank is not like that husband who abandoned you. He is a man who keeps his promises. That evening, Mei Lin sat down her second meal of the day, this one even more elaborate than the first. Rosa had prepared a full Christmas dinner with all the traditional accompaniments, and she insisted on serving it in the formal dining room with the good china and silverware. Frank had cleaned up and changed into his best clothes for the occasion, and he insisted on saying grace before they began eating. But his prayer was simple and heartfelt, thanking God for bringing them together on this Christmas day and asking for blessings on their new arrangement. As they ate, Frank explained more about the ranch and what Mei Lin's responsibilities would entail. The Thompson Ranch raised cattle and horses, selling beef to markets in Denver and Cheyenne and breeding stock to other ranchers throughout the region. It was a complex business that required careful record-keeping, extensive correspondence, and skillful negotiation with buyers and suppliers. The work isn't difficult, Frank explained, but it requires attention to detail and the ability to deal with all kinds of people. Some of the buyers can be pretty tough customers, and you'll need to hold your own in negotiations. Mei Lin nodded, feeling more confident with each detail he provided. In Hong Kong, I help my father sell goods to ship captains. Sometimes they try to cheat us, but I learn to be firm about prices. Perfect, Frank said with satisfaction. That's exactly the kind of experience that will serve you well here. As the evening wore on, Mei Lin found herself relaxing in a way she had not experienced since leaving Hong Kong. The house was warm and comfortable, the food was plentiful and delicious, and both Frank and Rosa treated her with a respect and kindness that she had almost forgotten was possible. But perhaps most importantly, she was being offered the chance to contribute something valuable, to earn her place through her own efforts rather than existing as a dependent or charity case. It was the opportunity she had dreamed of when she first decided to leave her homeland, the chance to build a new life based on her own abilities and determination. That night, as she settled into the comfortable bed in her new room, Mei Lin reflected on the miraculous turn her life had taken. This morning, she had been facing the very real possibility of freezing or starving to death in a hostile town. Now she was warm and fed with the promise of meaningful work and a place where she might finally belong. Outside her window, the snow continued to fall across the prairie, but it no longer seemed like an enemy. Instead, it looked like a clean blanket covering the land, preparing it for the new growth that would come with spring. And for the first time since arriving in America, Mei Lin felt that she too might be ready for a new beginning. Spring came late to the Nebraska plains that year, but when it finally arrived in early April, it brought with it a transformation that extended far beyond the greening of the prairie grass. Mei Lin had been living and working at the Thompson Ranch for nearly 4 months, and the change in her circumstances was nothing short of miraculous. The young woman who had nearly frozen to death in a cold apartment above Henderson's general store had been replaced by someone confident and capable. Her English had improved dramatically through daily practice with Frank's business correspondence, and her understanding of ranch operations had grown from complete ignorance to genuine expertise. More importantly, she had found something she had never expected to discover in America, a place where she truly belonged. Frank had proven to be an excellent teacher and a fair employer. He had started her with simple tasks like organizing files and copying letters, but as her English improved and she demonstrated her natural aptitude for business, he had gradually given her more responsibility. By March, she was handling most of the ranch's correspondence independently, negotiating with suppliers, and maintaining the detailed records that were essential to running a successful cattle operation. "You have a natural head for business," Frank told her one morning as they reviewed the quarterly accounts together. "These books are better organized than they've been in years, and that contract you negotiated with the Denver buyers saved us nearly $300. Mei Lin felt a flush of pride at his praise. The work was challenging, but satisfying in a way that her previous life had never been. Each day brought new problems to solve and decisions to make, and she was discovering capabilities within herself that she had never known existed. Rosa had become like a mother to her, teaching her American customs and cooking techniques while also learning about Chinese traditions and recipes. The two women had developed an easy friendship that transcended their differences in age and background. Rosa's protective instincts had been aroused from the first day, and She took obvious pleasure in seeing Mei Lin grow stronger and more confident. "When you first arrived here, you were like a little bird with a broken wing," Rosa told her as they worked together in the kitchen one afternoon. "Now look at you. You stand tall, you speak with authority, and you're not afraid of anything." But Rosa's observation was not entirely accurate. There was one thing that Mei Lin was very much afraid of, and that was the growing attraction she felt toward Frank Thompson. Over the months of working closely with him, she had come to admire not just his fairness as an employer, but his character as a man. Frank was everything that David had pretended to be in his letters. He was honest in his dealings with everyone, from the wealthiest cattle buyer to the humblest ranch hand. He worked harder than anyone else on the ranch, but never asked anyone to do something he would not do himself. He treated Rosa with the respect due to a valued family member, and he had shown Mei Lin a kindness and consideration that had gradually healed the wounds left by her disastrous marriage. More troubling still was the growing evidence that Frank's feelings toward her were not entirely professional either. She caught him watching her sometimes when he thought she was not looking, and his manner toward her had subtly changed over the months. He was more careful about maintaining proper distance, more formal in his speech, as if he was fighting against feelings that he believed were inappropriate. The situation came to a head on a warm afternoon in late April when Frank returned early from a trip to town with disturbing news. Mei Lin was working at the desk in a ranch office, preparing invoices for a cattle shipment, when she heard his truck pull up to the house much earlier than expected. He came through the front door with a grim expression, and she could tell immediately that something was wrong. "What has happened?" she asked, rising from her chair with concern. Frank removed his hat and ran his fingers through his hair, a gesture she had learned to recognize as a sign that he was deeply troubled about something. "I ran into Dr. Morrison in town," he said slowly. "He had some news about your husband." Mei Lin felt her heart skip a beat. Over the months at the ranch, she had gradually stopped thinking about David as her husband. The marriage had been a legal arrangement that had never developed into anything resembling a real relationship, and his abandonment had seemed to end whatever obligation existed between them. "What news?" she asked, though she was not sure she wanted to hear the answer. Frank sat down heavily in the chair across from her desk. "David Chun was killed 3 weeks ago in a construction accident in Colorado. Dr. Morrison heard it from a friend who worked for the company that employed him." The news hit Mei Lin like a physical blow, though not in the way she might have expected. She felt no grief for David personally. Their relationship had been too brief and superficial to generate deep emotional attachment. But his death meant something far more significant. She was now officially a widow, free from the legal bonds that had tied her to a marriage that had never truly existed. "I am sorry," Frank continued, misreading her silence. "I know you too had your troubles, but he was still your husband." "No," Mei Lin said quietly. "He was never really my husband. Not in any way that mattered." Frank looked at her with surprise. "What do you mean?" For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Mei Lin told Frank the complete truth about her marriage to David. She explained about the marriage broker in Hong Kong, about the photographs and letters that had painted a false picture of American life, about David's disappointment when she arrived and his obvious relief when he finally abandoned her. "We were strangers who shared the same name," she said when she finished her account. "There was no love between us, no real partnership. I think we both knew from the beginning that it was a mistake." Frank listened to her story without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When she finished speaking, he was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the pastures where his cattle grazed in the afternoon sun. "I had wondered," he said finally. "You never seemed like a woman who was missing her husband, more like someone who was trying to forget a bad experience." The conversation might have ended there, but something in Frank's manner encouraged Mei Lin to continue. Perhaps it was the gentleness in his voice, or the way he had listened to her story without judgment, but she found herself speaking words that she had never intended to say aloud. "Frank, I must tell you something else. These months here, working with you, living in your house, I have been very happy. Happier than I ever was with David. Happier than I ever thought I could be in America." She paused, gathering courage for what she knew might be the most important words she would ever speak. I know it is not proper for me to say this, but I need you to know you have shown me what it means to be respected, to have my work valued, to be treated as an equal partner. You have given me a life that I never dreamed was possible. Frank turned from the window to look at her directly, and she could see in his eyes that he understood what she was trying to tell him. But instead of responding immediately, he stood up and moved to the door of the office. "Mei Lin," he said, using her first name for the first time since she had arrived at the ranch. "I think we both need some time to think about what this news means and where it leaves us." But as he reached for the door handle, Rosa appeared in the doorway, her face flushed with excitement. "Frank, Mei Lin," she called out. "Come quickly. There are riders coming up the road, and they look like they might be important visitors." Through the office window, they could see a small group of horsemen approaching the ranch house. Even at a distance, it was clear that these were not ordinary visitors. The horses were fine animals with expensive tack, and the men riding them wore the sort of clothes that spoke of wealth and position. Frank's expression became wary. "I wonder what they want. We're not expecting any buyers today." As the riders drew closer, Mei Lin recognized the lead figure and felt her heart sink. It was Mr. Henderson, the owner of the general store where she had lived above his establishment during her darkest days in Cedar Ridge. With him were 3 other men she did not recognize, but their expensive clothes and confident bearing suggested they were people of influence in the community. "This doesn't look like a social call," Frank muttered as he moved toward the front door. The 4 men dismounted and approached the porch with expressions that ranged from stern to openly hostile. Mr. Henderson stepped forward as their spokesman, his face set in lines of disapproval that Mei Lin remembered all too well. "Mr. Thompson," Henderson began without preamble, "we need to have a discussion about the situation you've created by harboring this woman." Frank's jaw tightened, but his voice remained controlled. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you mean by situation, Henderson. Miss Chun is my employee and a valued member of my household staff." One of the other men, a well-dressed individual with the bearing of a successful businessman, stepped forward. "Mr. Thompson, I'm James Crawford, president of the Cedar Ridge Town Council. We've received numerous complaints about the impropriety of your arrangement with Mrs. Chun." "Miss Chun," Frank corrected firmly, "and there's nothing improper about employing someone to help manage my business." Crawford's expression suggested he found Frank's response inadequate. "An unmarried man living alone with a foreign woman? Surely you can understand how this appears to the decent people of our community." Rosa had moved to stand beside Mei Lin in the doorway, her protective instincts clearly aroused. "What business is it of yours how Mr. Thompson runs his household?" she demanded. Henderson turned his attention to Rosa with obvious distaste. "This matter doesn't concern you, woman. We're here to discuss a problem that affects the moral standards of our entire community." "The problem," added a third man whom Mei Lin recognized as one of the most vocal opponents of her presence at the church, "is that Mrs. Chen's husband is dead, which makes her current living arrangement even more scandalous than before." Frank's expression became dangerous. "How did you learn about David Chen's death?" Crawford looked uncomfortable. "Word travels in small communities, Mr. Thompson. The important thing is that we're here to offer a solution that will benefit everyone involved." He gestured toward the 4th member of their group, a thin man with nervous eyes who had remained silent until now. "This is Mr. William Harper from Omaha. He's prepared to offer Mrs. Chun employment in his household, where she can work under proper supervision and moral guidance." Harper stepped forward with an obsequious smile that made Mei Lin's skin crawl. "I operate a boarding house for working girls in Omaha, Mrs. Chun. You would have your own room, regular meals, and the companionship of other young women in similar circumstances." Mei Lin felt a chill of fear as she realized what was actually being proposed. Harper's description of his boarding house and his mention of working girls made it clear that this was not a legitimate employment opportunity. These men were trying to force her into a situation that would be little better than slavery. Frank had apparently reached the same conclusion, because his voice took on a tone that Mei Lin had never heard before. "Gentlemen, I believe you've overstayed your welcome. Miss Chun is under no obligation to discuss employment opportunities with anyone, and she's certainly not required to justify her living arrangements to a group of self-appointed moral guardians. Crawford's face reddened. Mr. Thompson, you're making a serious mistake. The people of Cedar Ridge will not tolerate this kind of behavior indefinitely. There are ways to deal with those who refuse to respect community standards. The threat was unmistakable, and Frank took a step forward, his hands clenched at his sides. Are you threatening me on my own property, Crawford? Before the situation could escalate further, Mei Lin stepped forward. She had spent too many months building her confidence and self-respect to let these men intimidate her now. Gentlemen, she said in clear, precise English that demonstrated just how much her language skills had improved, I thank you for your concern about my welfare, but it is completely unnecessary. I am employed here as Mr. Thompson's business manager, a position I have earned through my own abilities and hard work. She looked directly at Harper, letting her disgust show plainly in her expression. As for your offer, Mr. Harper, I must decline. I am quite satisfied with my current situation. Henderson's face showed his frustration. Mrs. Chun, you don't seem to understand the seriousness of this matter. Your presence here is causing scandal and division in our community. Surely you don't want to be responsible for that kind of trouble. The only trouble I see, Rosa interjected angrily, is a group of men with nothing better to do than interfere in other people's business. Crawford turned his attention back to Frank. Mr. Thompson, we're prepared to be reasonable about this. If you'll encourage Mrs. Chun to accept Mr. Harper's generous offer, the community is willing to overlook the impropriety of the past few months. Frank's response was immediate and decisive. The community's forgiveness is not something I've asked for, Crawford, and it's not something I need. What Miss Chun chooses to do with her life is her decision, not yours, not mine, and certainly not the business of your so-called moral committee. The confrontation might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Frank looked past the group of unwelcome visitors to see a familiar figure riding up the ranch road. Dr. Morrison, accompanied by a younger man that Frank did not recognize. The doctor dismounted and approached the group with a puzzled expression. Gentlemen, I hope you don't mind my interrupting, but I saw your horses and thought there might be some kind of emergency. Crawford looked uncomfortable at Dr. Morrison's arrival. Just a community matter, Doctor. Nothing that concerns you. But Dr. Morrison's attention had already shifted to Mei Lin, and he could see the distress in her expression. Miss Chun, is everything all right? Before she could answer, the young man who had accompanied Dr. Morrison stepped forward with obvious excitement. Excuse me, but are you Mei Lin Chin? The woman who's been managing the Thompson Ranch business correspondence. Mei Lin looked at the stranger with confusion. Yes, I am, but I do not know who you are. The young man extended his hand with a broad smile. I'm Robert Martinez from the Cattlemen's Association in Denver. Dr. Morrison told me about your work here, and I've been hoping to meet you. We've been hearing remarkable things about the efficiency and professionalism of the Thompson Ranch's business operations. Frank looked as surprised as Mei Lin felt. What kind of things? Martinez turned to address Frank, while keeping his enthusiasm focused on Mei Lin. Mr. Thompson, your recent correspondence with buyers and suppliers has been extraordinarily professional. The contracts you've negotiated have been models of clarity and fairness, and several of our members have specifically mentioned the superior quality of your business communications. He turned back to Mei Lin. When Dr. Morrison mentioned that these improvements coincided with your employment here, I realized that you must be responsible for the transformation. Miss Chun, I'm here to offer you a position with the Cattlemen's Association. We need someone with your skills to help modernize business practices throughout the region. The offer hung in the air like a thunderbolt, and for a moment, everyone was silent. Crawford and his companions looked stunned, clearly unprepared for this development. Frank's expression was unreadable, though Mei Lin thought she saw a flash of something that might have been pride in his eyes. The position would pay very well, Martinez continued, and it would involve traveling throughout Colorado and Nebraska, helping ranchers improve their business operations. You'd be working with some of the most successful cattle operations in the West. It was everything Mei Lin had never dared to dream about. Recognition for her abilities, professional advancement, and the opportunity to build a career based entirely on her own merits. But as she looked at Frank's carefully controlled expression, she realized that accepting the offer would mean leaving the place where she had finally found happiness. Henderson and his companions were clearly struggling to process this unexpected turn of events. Their moral crusade against the improper Chinese woman had suddenly been complicated by the revelation that she was a highly regarded business professional whose skills were in demand throughout the region. "Miss Chun," Crawford said weakly, "surely you understand that this doesn't change the fundamental impropriety of your situation here." Dr. Morrison's expression became stern. "What impropriety would that be, Crawford?" "Miss Chun is a respected businesswoman who has transformed the Thompson Ranch into one of the most efficiently run operations in the state. If that's what you call improper, then perhaps we need more such impropriety in our community." Martinez looked confused by the tension he had obviously walked into. "I'm sorry, but is there some problem with Miss Chin's current position? Because from everything I've heard, she's exactly the kind of person the cattle industry needs to help it modernize and grow." Frank finally spoke, his voice carefully neutral. "There's no problem, Mr. Martinez. Miss Chun has done excellent work here, and she deserves whatever opportunities her abilities can earn her." But Mei Lin could hear something in his voice that made her heart ache. Despite everything they had shared over the past months, despite the growing feelings between them that neither had acknowledged, Frank was prepared to let her go if that would be best for her future. Standing there on the porch of the house that had become her home, surrounded by men who wanted to control her destiny for their own various purposes, Mei Lin realized that she had a choice to make. And for the first time in her life, it was truly her choice to make based on what she wanted rather than what others expected of her. She looked at Frank, then at Martinez, then at the group of men from town who still believed they had the right to dictate her future. When she spoke, her voice was clear and confident, the voice of a woman who had finally learned to value herself. "Gentlemen," she began, "I appreciate all of your various offers and concerns. But before I make any decisions about my future, I think it's time I had a private conversation with my employer about exactly where we all stand." The declaration sent ripples of shock through the assembled group, but Mei Lin had had enough of other people making decisions about her life. It was time for her to take control of her own destiny, whatever that might mean for her future at the Thompson Ranch.